I'm the CEO of the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, or ASI, and I'd really like to welcome all of you to our educational series and today's webinar in particular on human rights due diligence. So we've got human rights being addressed in a number of criteria in the ASI performance standard. So we saw this as a really great opportunity for us to dig a little bit deeper into understanding this important topic and, most importantly, how to go about implementation. So our presenter today is Vanessa Zimmerman, who is the CEO of the human rights consultancy Pillar-Two. Vanessa's a great person and a recognised global corporate sustainability expert who has a particular focus on human rights. She worked for 5 years as a legal advisor to Professor John Ruggie, who was the UN Special Representative on Business and Human Rights, and she was part of the core team that actually drafted the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which are also known as the UNGPs and one of the key references in ASI Standards. During her presentation today, Vanessa is also going to do a brief interview with Siobhan Toohill, who's the Group Head of Sustainability at the Westpac Banking Group in Australia. And Siobhan's going to give us some insights into practical implementation of human rights due diligence processes in a company setting. So thanks again for joining us, and Vanessa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Thank you for having me today. Okay, so today I'm going to just give you a little bit of an introduction into the current business and human rights landscape. We'll then talk a little bit about the ASI standards and what they say about human rights due diligence. Then I'll take you through what the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights say about human rights due diligence, because we're very lucky that the ASI standards are drawing from other existing standards, including the UN Guiding Principles. And so we have a great kind of existing tool in the UNGPs, as Fiona referred to them, to better understand what human rights due diligence is. I'll talk a little bit about horizon scanning as well, just for you to know what might be coming your way in terms of developments in human rights due diligence and what to look out for. And then, as Fiona mentioned, we do have Siobhan joining from Westpac Bank, and we thought that would provide you a really interesting perspective on what lenders might be looking for in terms of human rights due diligence and some of the key issues that they're dealing with. So just in terms of setting the context, I think it's always very helpful to remember what is going on in the broader business and human rights landscape. And this goes to why we do what we do, but also to think about how this area has developed, even just in the last the last 5 years, but also the last 2 years, and how things are moving along. And I think it's really important to note that companies we know that companies can have very positive impacts on human rights, but we also know that businesses can have negative impacts on human rights through their own activities and through their business relationships. And we know that businesses can impact on the entire range of internationally recognised human rights. In the past, we might have seen businesses alleged to have been involved more in economic, social and cultural rights issues in terms of perhaps, for example, when they're going into a particular community, impacts that they might have on cultural heritage or impacts that they might have on access to water and to land and issues like that. But we're now seeing companies being linked to issues on the civil and political rights landscape. So those types of rights that help us to participate in civil and political life, that enable us to speak freely, to live freely. And we're seeing the whole range of rights being relevant there. So we've seen issues, as you may have seen, around Facebook and other technology companies, around privacy, around other issues relating to online rights. We've seen climate change and human rights being linked. We're seeing all types of different issues come up. The other aspect to note is that it's much more common these days to see human rights language popping up in the mainstream media. And obviously we don't respect human rights because of reputational issues alone, but it is relevant to note that it is becoming far more common for expectations around human rights on companies to be featured in mainstream media, and for consumers, for business partners, for investors to be far more comfortable with using human rights terminology around companies. The third point is this is really relevant to all sectors. So I think around 10 or 15 years ago, we would have mainly seen extractive companies be referenced when it comes to human rights allegations or issues. Now it could be the entire range of companies. And I think that's why it is so important to see ASI including the whole aluminium value chain in terms of different sectors and different types of companies that might be using aluminium, because we know that those companies, A, have human rights responsibilities, but also could face challenges. That also brings me to the next point, which is that this is a whole of value chain initiative, and it's really important to understand that in terms of your own operations, you may have particular risks that you might face when it comes to human rights issues, but you also do need to be paying attention to your business partners, and that could be downstream and upstream, and that we really need to think about what issues we might be involved with through our business relationships. Emerging and developed markets, so this is just really a point to say, and there's an example here. Those of you who are Australian will know this example, but those of you who are not, the headline there that says company fined for underpaying MCG workers hired to clean schools. So we have had situations in Australia of cleaning services being implicated in underpayment of wages, but also in some cases, unfortunately, modern slavery. So just to show that these issues, while there might be a greater risk in more difficult geographies, we can have issues in developed markets as well. And just challenges and opportunities here. So we do, obviously, there are many challenges that businesses can face when it comes to human rights, but we also have a lot of positive ways that businesses can contribute to human rights. And to think about that as you're doing your human rights due diligence and perhaps uncover some negative impacts, also thinking about what positive contributions you could be making. So I wanted to do an illustration for you just to show you the interconnectedness and the implications that can happen for a company that finds itself facing an allegation of essentially not performing human rights due diligence. And I want to stress that these are allegations. They're not founded yet. They haven't been decided in a court of law, but I thought this was an interesting example. So Nevsun Resources is a medium-sized mining company that has actually since been acquired by a Chinese company, but at the time was a Canadian mining company that mainly was operating in Eritrea with a mine that was a joint venture with the Eritrean government. The Eritrean government had a state-owned enterprise that was basically tasked with constructing the mine site. And there were allegations that the construction of the mine site occurred using forced labour and also some other human rights allegations that came in there. It is mandatory to do military service in Eritrea, and there were allegations that some of the workers were military labourers who were allegedly being abused. The case was brought to a Canadian court, so not in Eritrea. It was brought to a Canadian court where basically the allegation was that Nevsun should have known what was going on and should have done something about it, and that their activities had reached the level of complicity in forced labour and some other alleged human rights abuses. Nevsun repeatedly defended itself and said that Canada was not the appropriate forum for this case to be heard, and repeatedly asked the Canadian courts to not hear the case. The Canadian courts basically kept deciding to hear the case, and it's currently on appeal to the Supreme Court. Nothing has been decided on the facts yet, but this case has been going on for years, and you can imagine if you sit inside a company, the legal fees and the reputational impacts of this and the time that senior leadership has spent on this in terms of some of the impacts, the business impacts that this might have had on the company. In addition to the court case, the company was mentioned in a UK parliamentary motion, a TV program that is the equivalent of kind of the 60 Minutes in Canada, and various other allegations in civil society reports. The Eritrean mine's human rights record was also allegedly considered as part of broader acquisition discussions for the company. So this wasn't just something that was considered separately to the company's other operations. It came up in discussions relating to the acquisition. That's what some of the media reports say. In response, Nevsun adopted a standalone human rights policy and integrated human rights into their code of ethics. The Eritrean joint venture commissioned a human rights impact assessment and audits of those assessments, and they're actually public and they're very interesting documents to look through. They're actually very thorough. And the Eritrean joint venture adopted a workers' rights policy. And I guess this is just to show you that some of the impacts that you can have if there is a feeling that the company obviously has not conducted human rights due diligence, but also some of the steps that a company can take afterwards. So sometimes we find impacts not through preemptive kind of proactive steps, but because something happens. But then there are many steps that you can take to react to that still fall under the human rights due diligence framework and that can still help you to manage any further impacts in the future. Just a reminder of the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative and the key aims, and Fiona could do this much better than me, but I just wanted to reiterate some of them. So obviously this is a common standard for the entire aluminium value chain on environmental, social and governance performance, including human rights. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the different aspects that the ASI deals with across governance, environment and social. And human rights comes under social, as do labour rights and occupational health and safety. This is independently audited, so we know that there is objective evidence that is available where companies are being certified. And I think that that is incredibly important, and really important to think about what questions the auditors are actually asking, and how we can respond to that. And we'll talk more about that later. This is really the aim of this initiative, is to reinforce and promote consumer and stakeholder confidence in aluminium. And it's also a broader reference for improving and establishing responsible production, sourcing and material stewardship initiatives in metal supply chains more broadly. It highlights the importance of responsible business conduct across the entire aluminium value chain, and I think this is really important. And as someone who worked in a mining company, for me, it is very important that under the ASI, it really provides the forum to have a conversation with suppliers, but also with customers, which I think is very important. And as you can see from the little graphic on the right at the bottom, number 9 is basically the standard that is human rights, and that really covers nearly every type of company in the aluminium supply chain except for 2 of them. And I think it's important to note that that means that you can have a conversation downstream and upstream with companies in this initiative, which is incredibly important. There is a standalone human rights chapter, but as we'll talk about a little bit today, it shouldn't be siloed off from the other chapters. So we know that issues like labour rights, obviously occupational health and safety, business integrity, water stewardship, all of those have human rights implications too. So I would encourage you, when you're looking through the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative standard, to be aware that there might be a specific human rights chapter, but there will be other places where human rights issues will be relevant as well, including to human rights due diligence. The human rights principle, which kind of sits above all of the criteria that are in number 9, is that the entity shall respect and support individual and collective human rights affected by its operations. The entity shall take appropriate action to assess, prevent and remedy potential adverse impacts on human rights in a manner that is consistent with international instruments on human rights. And that very much reflects the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, on which the ASI standard number 9 is based. We see that in addition to human rights due diligence, which we'll talk about today, there are a number of other criteria in standard number 9 around women's rights, Indigenous peoples. I won't go through them all, they're all on the screen, but resettlement, security practice, and really trying to cover all of the different types of human rights that we know that companies in the aluminium value chain are likely to face. So it's a very important standard to read the whole way through. Today we will just focus though on 9.1, which is human rights due diligence. And I'm very, as someone who is very biased, having been part of the drafting team for the UNGPs, but I'm really proud to see the UNGPs appearing here, and I think it's very smart too, because there are companies. It can be, this might be a bit of an Australian Aussie phrase, but there can be a spaghetti soup sometimes when it comes to all of the business and human rights standards that are out there and that companies have to contend with. And I think it's very helpful when initiatives like ASI use a standard that many companies are using, which means that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. So under 9.1, which very closely tracks the UN Guiding Principles, entities are expected to have a policy commitment to respect human rights, a human rights due diligence process that seeks to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how it addresses its actual and potential impacts on human rights, and also to provide for or cooperate in remediation where the entity identifies that they might have caused or contributed to an adverse human rights impact. Over on the right, there are the 2 definitions from the ASI in terms of how we define due diligence and human rights due diligence. And again, very helpfully, the ASI has defined human rights due diligence as the process that is basically set out in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And it is an ongoing management process that a reasonable and prudent enterprise needs to undertake in light of its circumstances, including sector, operating context, size, and similar factors, to meet its responsibility to respect human rights. And some of the really important terms there are ongoing. So this is not something we do just once at the beginning of a project. We do it in an ongoing way so that we can keep understanding and acting on our human rights impacts. The other very important part here, which we'll talk about more in a moment, is that while every company, from a huge multinational to a small and medium-sized enterprise, has a responsibility to respect human rights, to do no harm, the way that you meet that responsibility to respect and the processes that you have to carry out human rights due diligence could be different depending on your size and your sector and where you're operating. And so it's important to remember that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, although all companies are expected to respect human rights. So before we jump into the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, I just wanted to quickly get everyone on the same page on what we mean by human rights, because it's a big phrase. It does mean different things to different people. Sometimes the umbrella nature of it is not well understood. So sometimes people will think of it as just one type of issue that comes up, whereas when we say internationally recognized human rights, we mean a lot of different types of human rights that come under that umbrella. So human rights are the basic rights and freedoms that we all enjoy as human beings, individually, in some cases such as Indigenous peoples collectively. They apply to us regardless of where we've come from, where we live, the colour of our skin, what religion we practice, which is really important. And in addition to having internationally recognised human rights, we can talk about taking a rights-based approach, which means acting in a way that is respectful of people's rights, does not discriminate against people, provides transparency and accountability. Internationally recognised human rights are enshrined in core documents that were really drafted by governments for governments, but through documents like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, we understand now what they mean for businesses as well. Governments have the primary duty to respect, protect, fulfil and promote human rights, and businesses, we now know, have a responsibility to respect human rights. So at a very basic level, to do no harm, and when you do harm, to have ways of remediating that harm if you feel that you've caused or contributed to it. As I mentioned before, there are different types of human rights. So there are civil and political rights that allow us to live basically safely and securely and free and in a free way. And then we have economic, social and cultural rights that allow us to live in good health and to be able to have an adequate standard of living and to take part in cultural life. And there's a list there of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And just quickly, it's always, I think, a good idea for a company to sit with a list of the rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and think about what rights might be most relevant to them as a company in terms of how the company, not risks to the company, but how the company might pose risks to human beings and to these rights through its activities or its relationships. So what do human rights mean for business? And the little graphic on the left-hand side is actually the salient human rights risks that Rio Tinto has identified as a company, and that's all publicly available information. And basically it means the types of human rights risks that the company has identified it could have potentially the most severe impact on through its own activities or through its business relationships. And as a mining company, it probably wouldn't surprise you that we're thinking about issues like security, in migration, land access and resettlement, Indigenous peoples, environment and labour rights, including modern slavery. And on the right-hand side, I've just put a couple of examples there because the internationally recognised human right are the rights that we've taken, let's say, from the Universal Declaration. On the right-hand side are some examples. So if we take just a couple of them, the right to work, including the right to safe and healthy working conditions, that could be a situation where you have a uniform supplier, where you understand that there are poor working conditions there, including excessive hours and inadequate safety equipment. The right to health could be a situation where you have an influx of construction workers that come in to build. It could be a mine site, but it could be a factory, it could be it could be any type of infrastructure development. And we have an influx of construction workers, let's say, that come in to a particular location that hasn't in the past seen particular sexually transmitted infections or diseases, and those workers bring those diseases in, and we have an issue there with the right to health. The right to security of person could be contracted security providers that are, let's say, protecting a site. And again, it could be a mine, but it could be a factory. Let's say if there was a strike and they use excessive force in the company's name. So this is just, it's a good idea to think about in plain English, what could some of these rights mean for your company? So the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or the UNGPs, as we referred to before, there's a picture of them there. And the basic expectation, the UNGPs have 3 pillars. They have Pillar 1, which is around the state duties and what governments are required to do. Pillar 2, which is the business responsibility to respect human rights. And Pillar 3, which is around remediation. And we're going to focus today on the responsibility to respect human rights and human rights due diligence. So within the business responsibility to respect human rights, as I mentioned before, the basic expectation is that businesses do no harm, and if they do harm, that they look for ways to remediate where they've identified they've caused or contributed to that harm. The way that you meet the business responsibility to respect human rights is through these 3 elements. So having a policy commitment, as we spoke about before, which is in the ASI criteria 9.1, doing human rights due diligence, which obviously we'll dive into today, and having processes to enable remediation. And it's very, as I said before, it's very good to see that the ASI standard uses these 3 elements from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. What is human rights due diligence? Where did it come from and what does it mean? And I've put a quote there from Theresa May. I know she might be polarizing for some people, but I really like this quote from her, which she said when she was Home Secretary, and she was very passionate about modern slavery. And so this was a quote about modern slavery, but to me it applies more broadly to other human rights issues, including human rights due diligence and the whole point of human rights due diligence. And what she said is that it is simply not acceptable for any organisation to say in the 21st century that they did not know. And this is about the fact that human rights due diligence allows you to know and show as a business that you are preventing and addressing your involvement in adverse human rights impacts. It is really not okay anymore to say as a business that it was too hard for us, it was too complex, we couldn't find out what impacts we might be having, and we couldn't do anything about them. And no one is expecting you to solve everything tomorrow, but you need to at least try. And that's really what human rights due diligence is about, trying to find what your adverse impacts might be and to do something about it. This applies, as we said, it applies to all companies, but it might change slightly. If you're a large company, you might do different things to conduct human rights due diligence than what you might do as a small and medium-sized enterprise. When we talked about this concept when we were drafting the UN Guiding Principles, we basically borrowed a lot of the elements of human rights due diligence from transactional due diligence that you might do before a major merger or an acquisition or even a divestment. But there are a couple of differences. And one of the main differences is that when you're doing transactional due diligence, you're mainly looking at risks to the company. When you're doing human rights due diligence, you need to look at risks to rights holders. You're not looking at risks to the company. You're looking at what risks the company might be posing to rights holders. And I know that that can be a difficult conversation to have internally. Usually they should be aligned. So usually if you're going to have pose a significant risk to rights holders, then you're likely to be having risks for the company in terms of financing risks, operational risks if a mine gets shut down, legal risks, reputational risks. But it's not always the case. And some of you may remember several years ago, and I won't name the car company, but there was a particular car company that, and I'm simplifying, but essentially found that there was a fault with one of the cars and decided that it would be cheaper to just pay any costs from wrongful death suits in law courts rather than recalling all the cars to fix the fault. That is not putting rights holders first, and that's not looking at risks to rights holders first. So it's important in human rights due diligence that we think about that. This is an ongoing process. As I said before, you do it as early as possible in the development of a new activity, and you don't stop when you've created a new project. You keep looking at human rights impacts across the entire scope of a project. And there are 4 elements of due diligence, which we'll talk about in a moment: identifying and assessing your impacts, integrating the findings and taking appropriate action, tracking your human rights performance, and communicating appropriately. This relates to your potential and actual adverse impacts. So it's not just forward looking, it's also issues that might have occurred already, as well as issues that can occur in the future. It relates to your own activities and to your business relationships, which we'll talk about more, and it exists over and above legal compliance. So you may not have to do this, although we do have some countries now that require human rights due diligence plans, but you're still expected as a company to do this under the responsibility to respect human rights. The 4 elements of human rights due diligence, as I mentioned before, and the graphic on the right is from Heineken, where they have just put into one of their reports how they see human rights due diligence. So the first is that you identify and assess your actual and potential adverse human rights impacts through your own activities and your associated relationships. And this is obviously key, because if you don't know what your human rights impacts are, then you can't do anything about them. And it's very clear in the UN Guiding Principles that you need to speak to rights holders or to their representatives in any way you can, and obviously in a way that doesn't put them at risk or doesn't put anyone at the company at risk. But it's very important to speak with potentially impacted or impacted rights holders to talk about what impacts the company might be having. It is very tempting sometimes to do a human rights risk analysis from a desk and not really speak to the rights holders that might be impacted. But it is important to at least make efforts to do that, or to speak to their representatives, or to find some other way of really understanding what impacts you might be having. And just to link back here to criteria 2.5 of the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative standard, which basically requires companies and entities to understand their human rights impacts and to assess them. The guidance for 2.5 then explains that you don't have to do a standalone human rights impact assessment, but you should be integrating human rights impacts into social and environmental impact assessments, and you can choose to do a standalone assessment. And I think that there's been a webinar with Kendall from Nomagaya about human rights impact assessments, which you can also always go into the AI portal to listen to. The second element of human rights due diligence is that you integrate the findings from human rights impact assessments across relevant internal functions and processes and take appropriate action. So if you've found impacts, you do something about them. And that may differ depending on how closely involved you are with the impact, if it was your own company that was causing it, or if you were contributing or directly linked through another organisation, but you do something about it. It also means having the right resources there to be able to do something about it. So to have the people that you need, to have the funding that you need, to train people well enough so that they actually can act on an adverse human rights impact that you might have found. The third element is tracking company human rights performance to verify whether adverse human rights impacts are being effectively addressed. And for those of you that might be grappling with the Australian Modern Slavery Act, there's a direct parallel here with the requirement in the Australian Modern Slavery Act, which requires companies to show how they know they're going to be effective ensuring that they're not involved in modern slavery. And tracking could include doing an internal audits, it could include setting key performance indicators that are qualitative and quantitative. There are lots of different ways that a company could track that it's actually doing something about the impacts that it's found. The fourth element is communicating publicly where appropriate on company responses to actual and potential human rights impacts. And this is about not only big fancy annual reports or sustainable development reports, but also the communications that you do with your stakeholders throughout the year, whether it's rights holders, investors, customers, to talk about how you're actually tracking on your human rights performance and what issues that you might have there. And that businesses should particularly consider formally reporting on any severe impacts that they might have had. So just a note on prioritisation. For the larger companies on the call, the UN Guiding Principles do recognise that it could be unreasonably difficult to conduct human rights due diligence in the same way across a complex value chain. So for companies that have, let's say, 35,000 suppliers or numerous joint venture partners or franchisees, there's an understanding there that it could be quite difficult to do the same level of scrutiny, to do the same level of identification assessment across that entire value chain. So the guiding principles talk about identifying general areas where the risk of adverse human rights impacts might be the most significant and prioritising those for human rights due diligence. And it's important to think about where are your business, and particularly with your business partners, where are they operating? What are they doing? Are they operating in countries where we're very worried about the human rights landscape? Are they operating in particular industries where we're worried? And you can see there some of the higher risk industries for forced labour, but some of those industries that we might be a little bit more concerned about, some of which are included, obviously mining, manufacturing, food and beverage that might be linked into the aluminium value chain as well. The guiding principles talk about paying particularly close attention to severe human rights impacts, so to involvement in a severe human rights impact. And that is based on the scale, scope and irremediable character of an impact. So something that and it's all a little bit relative, but it would be something that a severe impact is something that potentially affects a high number of people, is irremediable, which means that even with the biggest compensation payment, you're never really going to be able to put someone back to where they were. So obviously if someone loses their life, but also if a child loses their right to education and goes their entire childhood without education, very hard to ever remediate that. I would just caution to allow some discretion, because sometimes when we apply strict tests here, such as a spend level, or we only look at companies in high-risk countries to look at, or high-risk industries, that issues, as I mentioned before, can occur in a developed country, it can occur below a minimum spend, and just to really equip your people to be able to speak up if they see something that's not right, even if it doesn't meet the tests that you've set for prioritisation. So just a note on severity, and the term salient, because some of you may have heard that term being used. So the UNGP's reporting framework, which is a joint initiative between the SHIFT project, MASARS, and I think there's some other institutions involved there, really talk about helping a company to identify their salient human rights risks, and essentially, and this links into severity, and it's designed to help a company to prioritize, to think about their most salient human rights risk areas. The term salient is not itself in the UN Guiding Principles, but it's starting to be used a lot more now, by companies in their reporting, and particularly we expect it to be a term that is coming up more and more often by investors, by civil society, by others to say, well, as a company, how have you identified your salient human rights risk areas, the human rights issues that stand out because they are at risk of the most severe negative impacts through your company's activities or business relationships, and how are you going to do human rights due diligence on those particular areas. So on the right-hand side, I've taken this from page 71 of the ASI Performance Standard Guidance, which is a great document. And basically, these are some of the areas that the ASI has identified that might be the most relevant or the most salient for companies in the aluminium value chain. So it's health and safety, Indigenous peoples, working hours, various labour rights issues like freedom of association, discrimination, migrant worker status, and gender equity, human trafficking and forced labour, and security and human rights. And I think the important thing to remember is that while many of these might be particularly relevant for some of the mining companies and some of the other companies that are more in that part of the value chain, these are relevant also to companies that might be manufacturing, that companies that might be retailing various products, could obviously also have issues to do with various workers' rights, but also in some cases some of the other issues too, including security and human rights, as I mentioned before, if they were dealing with a protest outside a factory or manufacturing plant. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on this. This can be a bit confusing, I know, for companies. So I encourage you to go and look at the UN Guiding Principles, particularly at UNGP 19. This document is an oldie but a goodie, as we say. So it's fairly old. It's the state of play relating to business relationships that was done by the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights and the Institute for Human Rights and Business. And this is a diagram. There's a few typos in it, but it's a good graphic. So this is to show that when you're thinking about the appropriate action you would take if you found an adverse impact, either a potential or an actual, it depends on your degree of involvement in that adverse impact. So if you've caused something as a company, if you as a company have actually discriminated against someone, you've caused that impact, you should be ceasing or preventing the impact, and you should, this is where the typo is, you should provide for or cooperate in remediation through legitimate processes if you identify that you have caused that impact. If you have contributed to an impact, so you haven't caused it, but you've contributed to it through a business relationship, and that could be a situation where, let's say, again, there is a protest outside a mine site or a factory, and I don't mean to be flippant, but you basically say to your security providers, could you please stop this protest by any means necessary, and that security company does use excessive force. That could be a situation that could be moving towards the contribution. That but for, these are not legal tests, but really kind of but for your encouragement and support and kind of, in some cases, failure to tell them not to do something that wasn't right, and they took that as meaning they should move forward without reference to human rights, that could be a contribution. In that situation, you should cease or prevent your contribution, use your leverage to mitigate any remaining impacts, and again, provide for cooperating remediation. For those that are more up the other end of the value chain, the example that John Ruggie, the author of the Guiding Principles, provides is a situation perhaps where a phone company sets targets for manufacturing of a phone, suddenly changes the schedule, through their buying practices, suddenly gives the manufacturing company only 2 weeks when they had a month beforehand, asks for all sorts of change requests and doesn't change the price, which leads the manufacturing company to have to bring on a lot more workers and potentially have abuse of those workers going on. So that could be a contribution in that situation. Then there's directly linked, where you might not have caused or contributed, but you're directly linked to something through your products, services, and operations. And that could be a car company or a food and beverage company that's directly linked to, let's say, a human rights abuse in a mining company because of the mining company providing bauxite through that whole process that happens there. In that situation, the company should seek to prevent and mitigate the impact, should really try and increase their leverage to encourage the company in their value chain to behave better. And if they can't, should seriously consider whether they should leave the relationship. And they may take a role in remediation. They're not required to. So just to bear that in mind as you're thinking about, issues that might come up when you're doing human rights due diligence. And you might find that an auditor asks you that. You might find that an auditor says to you, well, what do you do in situations where you might be directly linked to some of these situations, and just to become a little bit more comfortable with that language through the certification process. So just very quickly, because I'm conscious that we would love to get Siobhan on the line, I've only got a couple more slides. This is just an illustration. And again, I'm a little bit modern slavery focused today just because here in Australia, a lot of companies are focusing on this issue. And under the Australian legislation, companies are required to report on the due diligence that they're doing around modern slavery. And this is just kind of trying to map for you what you might report on or what you might speak to an auditor about when they say to you, well, what human rights due diligence are you doing around an issue like modern slavery? So if we look at the 4 elements of due diligence, if we start with identifying and assessing the actual and potential adverse human rights impacts, as we spoke about before, the types of things you might speak to an auditor about could be that you've been screening new and existing suppliers for issues relating to modern slavery, that you've consulted with contracted workers, because remember that consultation with impacted rights holders is very important, that you might have included modern slavery in a social impact assessment. So you might have made sure that there were labour rights issues included in a social impact assessment and not just some of the more community focused issues that we might be having. I won't go through all of them, but tracking company human rights performance. So this might be that you might talk to the auditor about the fact that you've done an internal audit of supplier screening, that you've brought into the company a big new program to screen existing and new suppliers, but a year later you've checked to see that it's working. That's an example of how you might talk about tracking company human rights performance if you're speaking to an auditor about this. And communicating publicly could be the various, public communications that you've put out there. And this is about the status of the UNGP. So I just wanted to remind everyone that this is not a treaty. As Fiona asked me just before the call started, for those of the early birds, we do have a treaty that's being discussed at the United Nations that may place some direct obligations onto companies. We'll see what happens there. But the UNGPs are not a treaty. They're not binding law, but they are being incorporated into a lot of different corporate social responsibility initiatives, international laws, meaning that the blurring of the mandatory and the voluntary, as Professor Ruggie likes to say, is becoming, a little bit hard to distinguish. And so it is really prudent, I think, to understand the UNGPs. Obviously, they've been incorporated into the ASI, and they're really a good way for you to understand how you can manage your human rights risks. And the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, just for a quick plug for them, they came after Professor Ruggie. They are there at the UN to help companies to implement the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And I'd encourage you to have a look at their website, which we can always send through as well. And just really to compare a couple of the standards, because I know, as I said before, that you might all be dealing with a little bit of the spaghetti soup. The nice thing is that, and again, most of these standards have either specifically incorporated the UNGPs, or if they were drafted before the UNGPs, we have confirmation from those organisations that in interpreting the human rights provisions of those standards, such as the voluntary principles on security and human rights and the UN Global Compact, that companies should be using the UN guiding principles to interpret those provisions. And so some of these standards might be ones that you're using. I'm happy to say that the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, as I said before, covers the 3 key elements of the responsibility to respect, whereas some of the other standards that we see out there have not incorporated all the key elements. So just to end with a couple of tips and tools, one of the important elements here is to really, if you are in a mining company, but this might also apply to you, you've got decentralized models in other ways as well, but to ensure that your site level colleagues or your other business colleagues actually understand the concept of human rights due diligence. It is not particularly helpful if the corporate representative, really understands human rights due diligence, but someone at a site level does not understand, and really they're doing a lot already that they are doing human rights due diligence, but they don't realize they're doing it. And when the auditor asks them about it, they get a little bit flustered and don't necessarily, are not necessarily equipped to answer that. So I think doing some training, and not just because of the auditing, but because of your responsibility to respect human rights, but making sure they're equipped to answer that. So be prepared to speak to an auditor about cross-functional initiatives. So you may have all of these things that you're doing, once again, as a company, but you haven't necessarily neatly packaged them as human rights due diligence. And you might want to speak to the auditor about different initiatives that you are undertaking that really fall under that umbrella of human rights due diligence. Just remembering that carrying out effective human rights due diligence will go further than just standard number 9. So as I mentioned before, there are many other criteria in the ASI standard that relate to human rights, and so doing this will help you with those as well. Avoiding silos with other responsible business conduct issues. So if you're doing human rights due diligence and you see an anti-corruption issue pop up or a sanctions issue pop up, it's really important to be able to use these processes to identify systemic issues that might be coming up, even if they're not technically human rights. You use ASI membership to support different parts of the aluminium supply chain to respect human rights. And that's my very diplomatic way of saying that I think it is, as I said before, this initiative allows you to have conversations across the value chain. And I think that while sometimes we might feel a bit awkward, or we might feel we don't have the leverage to speak to a customer about these issues, the ASI actually gives you the platform to do that. And I think that it's good to have discussions going in all directions and making use of existing tools. So there are a lot of tools out there. There's the OECD due diligence guidance, which also builds on the UN guiding principles. There's the corporate human rights benchmark, which the methodology, if you read the methodology for the corporate human rights benchmark, which is a benchmark of large companies around the world in apparel, extractives, agriculture, now this year ICT as well. It basically, if you tried to fill that out as a company, if you're not included in the benchmark, but if you use that benchmark, you would basically be able to see how you're tracking on various different parts of human rights due diligence, because it tracks the UNGPs very closely. So just to use the tools that are out there. Just some particular tips for SMEs, because I know that we have some smaller and medium-sized enterprises on the phone for which, you don't have, I'm assuming, massive human rights departments or sometimes that internal expertise. So I think the first point here is to prioritise based on severity, what we talked about before. So you look at impacts where you might have the biggest impact on human beings in terms of scale, scope, and remediability. So are you literally just denying someone access to their house for a few hours, or are you taking away access to their land for years? They're the scale. We see that, the scale is much worse if you're taking something away from someone for years. How many people are going to be impacted? Can it ever be remediated? And to really try and focus your efforts on those more severe impacts. To work with peers as much as you can. So there might be situations where you could be, not to fall foul of any antitrust requirements, but there might be some collaborative approaches you could be taking to assessing, say, joint suppliers or issues like that, where you could actually be working together. Finding an internal champion who can help really show the business case here. I know sometimes I've heard the argument that, well, we're an SME, we don't have the resources, we don't have the capacity to do this. And I think the answer is that in many of these situations, especially really serious situations, you actually can't afford not to do this, because you need to be doing this. The bigger companies will be asking you for evidence of this, and you need to do it. Looking for publicly available tools. So Nestle has made its human rights training available online. The whole program is publicly available. And so if you don't have the capacity to build these online, or to go to build these internally, or to go to an external stakeholder, you can use some of these public source materials. Signal to customers when something's not realistic. So if something isn't realistic, or to another business partner, I think it's good to say something. I know the leverage is difficult there, but I think it's important to say something while still highlighting that as a company, you're going to have to show them that you're respecting human rights, but filling out a 50-page questionnaire is not really going to be effective for either of you. So really kind of identifying that for people. And then finally, just calling on relevant government bodies and other institutions to provide guidance for SMEs. I think it's important to speak up if you feel like there's not enough guidance around a particular legislative development or a particular policy development. I'm going to stop there and move to Siobhan, just so we have enough time for all the questions. And then I can always, if there are not more questions later, I can come back to the horizon scanning and the business case. So Siobhan Toohill has joined, which I'm very grateful for her joining, especially as it's dinner time here in Australia. So thank you. I won't talk too much about the right to food. And Siobhan is the group head of sustainability at Westpac Group, which is one of our biggest Australian banks.
Second biggest bank.
Second biggest. There you go. So thank you for joining. And Siobhan has a long history of work in the human rights area. And I've just popped up, to help us later, Siobhan, I've popped up some of the graphics there from your human rights action plan and some of your salient human rights risks that you've identified. But could you just start with telling us, because I think it's good to go back to first principles, why does Westpac care and care about and manage its human rights risks?
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. So we're a business, a bank. We operate right across the economy. In fact, as a bank, we touch every part of the economy. And so through our operations, we engage with people. We employ people, we do business with people. And of course, through our operations and our value chains, we can actually leverage or create positive impact or negative impact. And so we take the view that we have a responsibility around that. Westpac also has long had a commitment around wanting to be a leader in sustainability. We want to be known as an organisation that does the right thing. And so, we were one of the founding signatories of the UN Global Compact and the Equator Principles, which has a requirement around human rights consideration in project finance decisions. So this has been kind of part of our story for a very long time as well. And of course, then there's the downside, around it's about just managing risks. So in terms of our own operations or engaging with business partners who have poor human rights, that consequence of engaging with them may lead to reputational or legal risks, and for a bank, potentially credit risks as well.
Absolutely. And I'll come back to your salient human rights risks in a moment, but just because you've mentioned some of the customers and the clients, what do you expect of a client, an institutional customer, when it comes to human rights due diligence? And obviously you do this yourself, which we'll get into in a moment, but for a customer themselves, particularly, and maybe if we talk about a larger customer, but also an SME, what are you expecting them to do in terms of human rights due diligence?
And it does vary across different parts of the organisation, the different kinds of customers that we have. But for example, if we think about an institutional customer, so a large corporate that we might be banking, we have an ESG risk framework, and then we have specific ESG credit risk policy. So we've got these mechanisms, if you like, that start to call up the requirement to assess those customers, or in particular assess particular deals that we might be doing with an existing customer. So part of the approach of an organisation becoming a customer of Westpac is that we will review in terms of a range of environmental, social, governance risks. And under those social risks are in fact human rights risks. And there are certain sectors where you know that there's a higher level of risk around human rights risks. So for example, around soft commodities, you know that there's a higher degree of risk potentially around, for example, palm oil. There might be a higher degree of risk around land grabbing or illegal land acquisition. So you know that that's an area that you need to look out for when you're operating in that particular space.
Okay, and just building on that, because obviously some of your salient human rights risks do relate to particular risk areas that you know you might have through your customers, but also just as a huge organisation, operating in several jurisdictions. So can you just tell us what Westpac salient human rights risks are and how you went about identifying them? And I hope I've got the right graphic up there.
We actually sought some support to do this for the very first time, and that was really useful. So we worked with Shift, but what they did was they didn't tell us what the answers were. Rather, they stepped us through a process, and that was really a powerful way to approach this. And I'd certainly suggest that that's a useful way to consider it. So what we went through was a process of identifying what are the most relevant issues that might arise in our supply chain or that can arise when we're financing an organisation, or other kinds of risks that are associated with different kinds of activities across how we do business every day. And then we went through a process of then assessing those risks. And we started thinking about those risks in terms of the severity of risks to individuals. We thought about it in terms of just the different kinds of business activities. And for a bank, what's really important is around the vulnerability of certain groups of people. And we've certainly learnt a lot over the last year here in Australia around banking and vulnerability, and the importance of taking that incredibly seriously. And then we worked through a process of prioritisation. So we worked through, really that point around saliency being around risks to people, around really focusing around where those risks lie. And we thought about that in terms of the different roles that we play as an employer, as a customer, as a buyer, and then of course as a provider of financial services. And then also work through our role, our connection. So Vanessa, as you talked about earlier, that point around cause or our contribution to that issue, or the link to impact. So we kind of worked through that in those different dimensions as well. And then, what we did was we listed a large number of issues, but then we pulled it down to then what are the most significant salient issues for us. And we arrived at that, and then we tested it. We tested it internally with working groups. We tested it with our board. We tested it we have a stakeholder advisory council that's made up of different critical stakeholders to our business as well. And we sought feedback, and we finally arrived at 4 most salient, significant or salient issues for our organisation.
Thank you. And it's really important actually I'm doing well with my sayings today, but to know how the sausage is made, because a lot of people talk about identifying their salient human rights risks as part of human rights due diligence, but They don't really say how they did that. And so thank you for sharing that, because I think it's important. And Siobhan, you mentioned working groups, and I think, part of human rights due diligence, the second element, integration, is that you do have resourcing and you do kind of make sure that this is embedded throughout the company. Does one function at Westpac have overall accountability for managing the human rights risks? And can you tell us a bit more about the working group that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so certainly the sustainability team has, if you like, the overarching accountability. So it ladders in under the sustainability risk management framework. So that's where it gets called out. And my team has the role, if you like, around developing and managing the policy and then ensuring that we've got the right risk frameworks across the organisation. But we affect that, or we realise that through a number of different things. So yes, we have a working group, and that has representation of different parts of the organisation. So you've got people from Human Resources, focused on privacy, financial crime. We've got credit risk officers who are involved in assessing deals, or who play a second line role around overarching views around how deals are assessed. And then we've got also key people who are actually on that front line banking day to day, who have a particular level of experience to be able to bring insights back into that working group as well. And we also have people from data. Obviously, that's an area that's growing around interest from these kinds of risks as well. And we also have people who are involved in customer complaints and remediation of where we've got it wrong. So really important to have them. And of course, you have to have a lawyer. So we've got probably a few, if you actually counted it all up, there's probably a few lawyers in the room, but we definitely have someone from our dedicated legal function as well. But, as I mentioned before, then it's, yes, that working group plays a really critical role, but it's also how the human rights due diligence gets affected every day in terms of lending decisions, in terms of supply chain decisions, in terms of our HR or human rights functions within the organisation as well. Privacy also being critical too.
Just building on that, because I think it's really important, and that what you just said, you do human rights due diligence every day, and I think sometimes we think of this as like this standalone process that isn't integrated, but more often than not, actually, it's a lot of different things that are happening every day that then you would, as a sustainability function, kind of explain to people how that all fits under human rights due diligence. But it's not as if there's this kind of distinct process. And I wanted to test that with you as well as at Westpac. Is it it doesn't sound to me like it's a formal standalone process, but rather it's more an integrated approach that comes into everything that you're doing every day. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay.
Definitely integrated, but it will be designed in a specific way for the kind of activity. So if it's ESG risk assessment around institutional customers, there's a particular way that we do that. And if it's around a particular sector, as I said before, then you're going to have to apply a high level of scrutiny. And if it's under the Equator principles, you might even need to then have a formal ESG assessment that will bring in human rights into the consideration of that particular customer. Or it might be not a formal assessment, but it might be direct engagement with the customer, and you might seek particular information from that customer to determine whether or not you're comfortable, or whether you want to apply leverage and say, well, actually, we see that you've done X, Y, and Z, but actually we'd like you to do A, B, and C as well to give us comfort that you're managing this issue. And that comes back to that point of leverage as well.
Yes.
And then back in our supply chain, yes, we have responsible supply or responsible sourcing requirements there as well. So it's that every day. But again, and as you mentioned earlier, Vanessa, that point around it's the amount of spend, it's the country, it's the kind of sector. But, that doesn't stop the question that we must always ask ourselves around, how do I feel about this? If something doesn't feel right from a gut perspective, of course, that gets called out as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's that kind of smell test. We mentioned before that identification and assessment under the UN Guiding Principles is important to do with reference to what rights holders actually think. And often we can't always access a rights holder. It might not be safe, or it might not be realistic, but sometimes we, obviously we can speak to civil society representatives. And I just wondered how often you engage as a company with impacted rights holders and civil society, especially around some of those, I know there's been particular challenges where there have been expectations set that you might do that around an institutional loan, and obviously that could cause a lot of difficulties and some unintended consequences as well. So I'm just, that point around consulting with external stakeholders, how does Westpac go about doing that?
Yes, we do engage with civil society. That's really important. And sometimes we do that alone as Westpac, but actually increasingly we will do that with our peer banks here in Australia as well. So there might be times when actually we might have exposure to a particular customer operating in a particular sector, And actually it makes sense that the theme, if you like, gets discussed with civil society across the banks as a group to reflect on what does best practice look like, and what's the expectation around how we address the concerns in relation to that impacted or those impacted communities as well. And I think that's important. But what's been interesting also for banks is that we've kind of flipped it in terms of in the last year around thinking about our vulnerable customers, our everyday retail customers as well. And so how we think about how we engage with financial counsellors, in a way, they've become a new kind of civil society group for us in terms of impacted customers that we've now obviously we've always taken that into account, but it's kind of given a higher level of focus, given that vulnerable customers is a salient theme for us as an organisation as well. But yes, engaging is important. There are times when it's difficult. There might be times when there are allegations made that you may not agree with, but the point that we always take is where there's a concern, we engage, and we'll engage directly with our customer and seek to understand what's happening. If there's a concern, then we may seek to leverage, and in some cases, there might be times when it's enormously challenging and there may be considerations around exit, although leverage is always the preferred outcome.
Thank you. And it brings into that point as well that a company doesn't always necessarily leave a relationship when something's difficult. You are trying to build that leverage, and sometimes you have to, but most of the time it is a good idea to try and be building that capacity. Yeah, and just on to tracking, which is the third element of human rights due diligence, is often something that ties companies up in knots, I think, because we've done the assessments, we're starting to do something about it, but how are we actually going to measure that we're being effective and that we're making a difference? And I just wondered if you can give us any examples of how you might track how you're going, either in many different areas that you're working in, but if you've got any examples of tracking your human rights performance.
Yeah, look, and I'd say that, like many organisations, we probably still feel like, we're evolving here. In fact, I'd say any organisation is always evolving its approach to human rights. But I guess some examples for us might be around, responsible sourcing metrics. It might be around the proportion of organisations that we have engaged or assessed throughout the year. It might be around a register of assessed companies, of companies that we might be banking, that register of ESG risks. So we've tracked the nature of the human rights risks that we've assessed throughout the year to see if there's a trend emerging around the kinds of companies that we're having conversations with that A, we might be banking, or B, might be declining banking or declining deals with. So actually maintaining that overarching view is important as well. And of course, now we're starting to capture this more and more around the Modern Slavery Act requirements, both in the UK and of course emerging here in Australia. So it's kind of compelling us to do more here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for those. They're really practical examples, and the register is really interesting to hear about what you're doing there as well. So just last question, just really any advice you might have for SMEs. As I mentioned, there are some small and medium-sized enterprises on the line, and when you're looking at a smaller customer and you're looking at human rights due diligence, kind of related to the question I asked earlier, what would you expect of them if they're a bit smaller and they don't necessarily have the resources to do what a huge manufacturer or mining company might be able to do?
Yeah, look, it might be basic requirements around certain policies being in place. So it might be around HR policies, or for large companies, certainly you're looking for human rights policies, but that's certainly a start. In many cases, we'll do a media review, a check around that organisation. So it's kind of being mindful around how you can talk about where there might have been potential risks. Mm-hmm. It's not that if you've got risks that a company won't bank you, but actually it's the way that you might be able to talk about how you've addressed those risks in your own value chain as well. It's being willing to be open and honest, and it's about an openness to improving. So, for example, we had an organisation in our supply chain, still do, where we had some concerns around the nature of their operations, and we talked to them about, hey, we can work with you around putting in place a human rights policy, and we can make some suggestions to you around who you might want to work with as to do that, or to have a third-party accreditation around that. We think it's really important given the nature of the sector that you're working in. Generally, members or entities in the value chain actually want companies to do well, to do better. No one wants to walk away from a relationship. So I think you might be surprised at how a supplier or a customer might actually want to work with you to help you build or develop that human rights performance.
I agree with you, and I think it's so important just to have that openness there. So you don't have to necessarily have the 5-page human rights policy, but you have to know what your approach. You have to at least be willing to talk about what your approach might be to respecting human rights, and that you're aware that there could be an issue. And yeah, absolutely. All right, thank you. Fiona, have any questions come in?
Maybe if we have a reflective question around Vanessa and also Siobhan, how have you seen practices evolve, over the last 7 years since the UNGPs were launched? Because, the very early days, first steps have been taken and things start to get a bit more sophisticated or practices are shared and built on. What would be your both reflections on that?
Sure. Siobhan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly from my perspective, the evolution has been pretty amazing. And actually, Westpac only developed its first formal human rights position 2.5 years ago, although it's something that we talked about and referred to and had, signed up to various commitments, but we didn't actually articulate that first position. So that's been relatively recent, but we've done a lot of learning in that time. And certainly we had expected it from our customers for some time as well. So for us, yes, it's evolved quickly. That said, we've been doing assessments around our supply chains for a long time. But I think with the advent of the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, the requirement for companies to report against that, of course, now we've got the Modern Slavery Act here in Australia, so that has evolved. But also, as Vanessa mentioned earlier, things like the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, the fact that you've now got surveys that are very high profile. And so you're seeing customers across different sectors really reflecting quite considerably. And also investors are starting to ask questions. So I'm someone who does engage with our investors regularly. The frequency with which human rights questions are now being asked in ESG investor meetings has definitely increased as well. So we're seeing the level of interest increase, and I would say the level of sophistication is increasing. And I'm really proud Westpac is working with a group of banks globally around a new set of principles called the Principles for Responsible Banking, and human rights sits within that as being quite important for us as well.
Yeah, and I would agree with all of that. And I think it's been, for example, like when I see questions coming in from investors now, it's no longer, do you have a human rights policy? It's really in-depth questions about human rights due diligence and especially business partners and what the company is doing to build its capacity. I think also the salient human rights risk mapping, as we referred to before, and obviously Westpac has done that. You can start to see a lot of different companies that are now sitting there trying to decide, right, how are we going to map what our most severe impacts might be, and doing that exercise and reporting on it, which is quite a big development. I also see, obviously we're on an ASI webinar, but I think the aluminium initiatives like the ASI are incredibly important because, as I mentioned before, you've got a whole of value chain initiative. Nearly every actor in that chain is expected to do human rights due diligence, and the auditors are asking, and they're asking difficult questions. And then again, they're not just asking for a human rights policy at the corporate level. They want to know, they're drilling down at other business levels to see whether those beautiful corporate policies are actually being implemented, and that's quite a big deal. So I think there's some of the changes that we're seeing as well.
I had a question recently where the question was the analyst deliberately said, Siobhan, you're not allowed to answer this. We want the CEO or the chairman to answer this question. And it was a specific aspect around human rights. So the expectation that leaders are aware and have a deep level of understanding definitely has increased as well.
That's great. So it's flowing up and down. And I see Neil Wilkins from the Institute of Human Rights and Business, who's on our standards committee, is on the call, and he's shared a reference as well to an IHRB reference, which is a guide to human rights for small and medium-sized enterprises. Did you want to make a quick comment on that?
And it was only because it was mentioned the guidance there is a little dated now. It's produced by the EU would be about 8 years ago, so probably a little dated, but it does provide some starting points for small and medium-sized enterprises to begin to approach the wider sort of human rights due diligence paradigm. It can be a little daunting for smaller companies, and they keep being asked a range of questions. They possibly don't even understand the question, let alone have done any work around this. So it's a good guide for starting. Just to sort of add into the discussion, I think that we're getting more mainstream investors a lot more interested in these issues, and rather than it just being social investors, we're starting to see mainstream investors. I think that the corporate human rights benchmarks and other benchmarking criteria such as Know the Chain are starting to have an effect around this, and companies are starting to look to see where they're being ranked. And there's an expectation that companies, this won't just be the responsibility of the CSR department, but as others have mentioned, far more integrated into the way that the company is set up to run, so that these things are sort of operational processes rather than being the sort of bolt-ons that go on after the company has performed an action.
Thank you. And hi, Neil. And I agree with all of those. There is a slide with the corporate human rights benchmark. That is the list for the corporate human rights benchmark from last year. They base it on publicly available information. So some of the companies that did very poorly, it may be that they're doing something, but they're not being transparent about it. And that's something that's also really important to remember here, that as you move forward in human rights due diligence, you'll probably see more and more expectation that you actually put that information up online, and not just about your human rights policy, but how you're actually managing your impacts in practice. And again, the example there from Chevron is just that we're seeing more shareholder resolutions about human rights due diligence. But thanks, Neil.
Terrific. Now I have a question from someone in the audience, which is really interested in the human rights due diligence methodology side of things. And we get this question in ASI as well. People kind of look at methodologies such as from the Danish Institute, other ones that are around, and people, I think, worry about how do they know whether the methodology that they've chosen is thorough enough, and how can they be confident about the validity of the results?
Great question. So I think there are a lot of methodologies popping up, and there are methodologies kind of for broadly, let's say for like a human rights impact assessment, and then there will be separate methodologies for a supply chain risk assessment, and it can get all a little bit confusing. I think that my advice would be, again, coming back to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, if you have chosen a methodology that is really allowing you to, again, know and show that you're respecting human rights, that will help you to properly identify your impacts and act on them in a rights-based way, so in a way that doesn't put anyone at risk, that doesn't discriminate, that really allows you to take meaningful action that is focused on resolving risks to rights holders and not the company, then I think you can feel fairly comfortable. If you have a methodology that is really just designed to identify, that is really just a risk process for the company and designed to identify risks for the company, if it's not really suggesting that you speak to rights holders, but everything, as I said before, is kind of done from a desk, then those are the methodologies that I'd kind of worry a little bit more about. But the Danish Institute has some really great tools up there. Shift has some really good tools. The Institute for Human Rights and Business that Neil hails from has some important tools out there, as does GBI, which is the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights. And I could go on. I don't want to offend anyone that I haven't mentioned. I could go on and on. But using those UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles, as you're framing, as you're assessing different methodologies that you consider. But Siobhan, did you think about that when you were looking at different methodologies for the salient human rights risk mapping?
I mean, there are lots of different methodologies that banks use, and we went to an organisation that we felt could help us. And as I said, rather than doing the work for us, what they did was stepped us through a very eloquent methodology, which was in many respects quite simple. And then they helped us workshop that process. So in a way, we exercised the muscle of actually how to use that methodology. So they kind of observed us and watched us kind of go through that process. And now we feel like we've now got a method that we can use. And I think that the other part of the question, which is, how do you know that you've kind of got the right answers? Well, I think you only know by actually having lots of conversations, and you'll continue to refine it as time goes on. We're going back to review our human rights position over the next 6 months, and again, we'll seek expert advice, but we'll also tap into stakeholders as well to test those salient things.
And just to pick up on that point of Siobhan's just now on testing with stakeholders, I mean, there are some companies that will set up, and again, this sometimes is much more realistic for the larger ones, but there are some companies that will set up, external stakeholder advisory groups to review, and Unilever is an example, Marks and Spencer is another one, that once they've come up with a methodology, they do public and these groups kind of almost publicly report back on what they think of that methodology, and that may not be realistic for every company. It might be better to do something a little bit less formal than that, but there can be real benefit in speaking to external stakeholders to make sure that they think your methodology is legitimate.
Yeah, and we published our methodology. Yeah.
Which is great, and which is such a huge contribution, because as I said before, when people are grappling with that, to see how other companies have done it is really a big thing. In our last couple of minutes, I think it's always worth looking at what might be coming across the horizon on human rights, and this is a little bit broader than human rights due diligence, but it flows into human rights due diligence because the types of impacts you might have might start to kind of evolve, or the way that stakeholders react to them might start to evolve. And so this comes into, as you're identifying impacts and thinking about which stakeholders you'll speak to, it also comes into elements like tracking and communication as part of human rights due diligence, because we need to think about what new forums are people going to expect us to report in, and how are they going to expect us to track issues. So this is the list of key trends for 2019 from the Institute for Human Rights and Business. This comes out every year. The business and human rights community, I think, waits for this every year. And these are the trends for 2019. Many of them actually do relate to the rights of workers, to making sure that workers do have the rights that they're entitled to, particularly in building huge infrastructure projects, but also through other types of supply chains. Another trend here to watch out for is human rights defenders. And I've also got a graphic there on the right-hand side, which is the portal at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre on business, civic freedoms and human rights defenders. So there is a lot more discussion now on how businesses engage with human rights defenders. That could be a lawyer, it could be a community organisation, it could be a big international civil society organisation like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch. And it's really when an individual or a group comes to you to complain about a human rights issue, how do you react with them? Not just how do you respond to the particular issue, but are you respecting the rights of that human rights defender when they come to raise a complaint? And there are many ways that we know that human rights defenders are put at risk. It could be that their actual life is endangered or physical harm, but it could also be suing a human rights defender for defamation or some of the other types of lawsuits that we're seeing brought against human rights defenders that might take away their livelihood and really kind of constrict that civic space. So thinking about how you might be interacting with human rights defenders. AI and artificial intelligence, automation, really thinking about how you might be impacting on human rights through some of the technological advances that you might be doing as a company. And I know that it's hugely exciting, you know, some of the automation developments, AI, it's all exciting, but there can be negative impacts. And it's really important as you're doing your human rights due diligence to think about what some of those negative impacts might be and how you might go about addressing them. And again, to speak to stakeholders, to speak to workers' organisations to find out if they feel that certain developments might be impacting them. On the AI side, to speak to consumers and to have a look at that. The final element that I just wanted to mention is that the increasing links between human rights and climate change. These links are being made by national human rights institutions. There's a Philippines Human Rights Commission inquiry that some of the mining companies on the phone might know about, but also investors, civil society groups, and we know that there's also climate change litigation being in California, but also other places. And so just understanding as you're doing your human rights due diligence, and particularly that first element, identifying your human rights impacts, whether there might be human rights impacts linked to climate change issues that you're dealing with. Also, if we think about the second element of human rights due diligence, which is integration and building the capacity of people internally to address their human rights impacts, this might be something as simple as your climate change person or your environment person is part of your human rights working group, and you make sure that they understand how some of the climate change impacts that you might be having might also impact on human rights. So they're just a couple of the examples. I'd just mention as well, legislation is really moving forward in this area. So we do have pieces of legislation like the Australian Modern Slavery Act, but there's also legislation in France that some of you may know about that is basically, it's a duty of vigilance law that requires larger French companies to have a human rights due diligence plan and to implement it. And you can start to look at it, depending on how your French is, some of the plans are only in French, but you can start to look at companies' human rights due diligence, vigilance plans online and to see how they are talking about human rights due diligence. So I might stop there, Fiona, just because we're almost at time.
A huge thanks to Vanessa. Of course, we're all muted, but I feel like we should be giving you a little round of applause. And I think you've got one last slide just with some contact details and information on where you might be able to go for other resources. So ASI, we've obviously got our website. You can contact us for information about our standards and guidance. And if you want to get in contact with Vanessa, her contact details are there as well.